Now, you know, I used this picture to represent my class, and you might not know anything about this picture. It's a picture of Jonah being thrown up out of a whale's belly after spending 3 days inside it. It's an old biblical story. It's a myth. It's a fairy tale. That's one way of looking at it, and I don't mean that in a derogative manner. We know, for example, that some of the Grimm's brothers fairy tales are perhaps 15,000 years old. They've been traced way back. They're really, really old. And old stories are strange, and they're strange because, well, they've been told generation after generation after generation. And so you could imagine that something retold over such an expansive time has been reduced to its gist many, many times, and nothing that's in the story anymore is superfluous. It's all meaningful in some sense. It's sort of like a meta story. That's one way of thinking about it. Imagine that you took 100 books, 100 adventure books, and you had to extract out the central features of an adventure book. Now, it's hard to do that. It's like you're averaging across them or something like that, distilling them in some manner. Then you'd get a meta adventure, and it would be like a myth upon which all adventures are based. And this story is actually one of those stories. And I'm going to tell you what I think the story means. And I'm not saying that this is all it means, because most stories of this sort are in some sense inexhaustible. Just like great works of art are inexhaustible. There's more information in them than you can possibly articulate. That's what makes them profound. That's why you go look at them, because otherwise someone could just tell you about the painting and that would be the end of that, but that doesn't work. So Jonah is being spit up by this whale, and of course on the face of it that's an impossibility, because, well, you can't live inside a whale. That's why it's impossible. Now you may remember, and likely do, that you all know a story about someone who is inside a whale. That's Pinocchio, right? And you know, you go to that movie, maybe even as an adult, you watch that movie, and Geppetto's down there in the whale, in his little boat, you know, it's big cavernous inside. You don't really care that there's a bunch of things you don't care about. You don't care that those are drawings and not real people. You don't care about that. And you don't care that the inside of a whale isn't a cavern. And you don't care that Pinocchio's a puppet, for that matter. None of that matters to you at all, and that's because you're really strange creatures. And you don't even notice when you're doing something absolutely absurd, and that's one of those times when you are. But if someone taps you on the shoulder and says, you know, you're just watching drawings of a puppet. Puppets can't really move autonomously, and now he's at the bottom of the ocean. You have no idea why. He's going to rescue his father, and you're just sitting there and you're okay with that. And you'll say, shut up, because I want to finish watching the movie. And so that's interesting, you see. That tells you something about your unconscious, if you're psychoanalytically minded, because you're doing something that you cannot account for. Now you might say, well, it's enjoyable. Well, that's deep, man. You're really going a long ways with that. The question is, A, why is it comprehensible? B, why is it enjoyable? C, just exactly what are you doing there? And you think that whatever you are doing there is so valuable that you'll actually pay to do it. Weird. Very, very weird. And you know, when you read about, let's say, the archaic rituals of tribal people, and you ask yourself, just what are they up to? You might think, well, they're up to the same thing that you're up to when you go see a movie. So, and then you might also notice that the most expensive artifacts, or among the most expensive artifacts that human beings create, are movies. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars on them. And we consider that a good deal. And you know, it drives our technology too, because the high-tech movies, like the Marvel movies that require so much computer animation, they actually drive the demand for high-end graphics chips. So our technological advance forward is actually motivated in part by our desire to represent things fictionally in ever more spectacular manner. So, Jonah. Well, let me tell you the story of Jonah. And I'll tell you why I'm going to tell you it. This is from Camille Paglia, who's a critic of the modern university and a very brilliant woman, I would say, very controversial, incredibly rapid speaker, and she can think so fast, it's just unbelievable. She's really fun to watch if you like that sort of thing. Vicious adversary in an argument. She says the number one problem in academia today is not ignorant students, but ignorant professors who have substituted narrow expertise and theoretical sophistication, a preposterous term for breadth and depth of learning in the world history of art and thought. Art is a vast, interconnected web work, a fabricated tradition, and over-concentration on any one point is a distortion. Here's the problem. I wrestled with this when I was trying to understand some of the things that I'm going to teach you about. There's some things that you kind of have to grasp as a whole. You know, sometimes you have a flash of insight and a bunch of things that you didn't know were related fall together. That's supposed to happen in psychotherapy when you link different disparate patterns of behavior together because you've linked them, say, with a single cause, and you get this like excited feeling of illumination and possibility. And there are forms of communication that require the simultaneous realization of a multitude of disparate phenomena. Like a movie can be like that, you know, you listen to a movie, you watch a movie, and then you don't know what the hell's going on, and then something happens near the end, and bang, everything clicks together. And it's because you've sort of seen the thing as a whole. And a lot of the ways that we interact with the world that are mysterious are like that. And this is what Paglia is referring to, is that, and this is a psychoanalytic proposition, I would say, or a romantic proposition. The idea roughly is that way out in the periphery of reality are all those things that not only do you not know, but you don't even know you don't know, right? You're completely blind to their existence. And then there's unknown things that you have some suspicions about. And then there's unknown things that you can start to imagine and act out and dramatize. And so all of that is on the periphery of our knowledge. That's a psychoanalytic dictum. Where do thoughts come from? Well, partly they're nested in dreams. Dreams are the birthplace of thoughts. Fantasy, it's not that surprising. Fantasy is the birthplace of ideas. You know, if you're thinking about what you're going to do in the future, you enter into a reverie, a dream state, and you contemplate multiple possibilities, and then you start thinking them through. Use your imagination to search beyond where you are. And the collective human attempt to do that is our mysterious, humanistic, artistic tradition, which is very difficult to justify from a formal, articulate point of view. What good is dance? Like, what is it that you're doing when you're dancing? Well, you don't care because you like to dance. Why? Well, you don't know, but you do. It's built into you. Music. Music's a human universal. Cultures use music to organize themselves, right? They use music to catalyze their identities. They use music to unite around. You know, in more archaic societies, less differentiated societies, let's say, you know, a mask that represents part of the family tradition will have a particular design, and there'll be a particular song written for it, and there'll be a particular dance about it. And the song and the dance are something like the symbolic representation of a mode of being in the world. Like maybe the mask is a wolf mask, and so you act out the wolf, and there's music that goes along with that. And you think, well, what are you doing when you're acting out the wolf? And part of that is, well, you're trying to understand wolves. You know, it's imitation in part, and you know, if you live in the natural world, and if you hunt and if you're preyed upon, then understanding the things that you're hunting and preying upon is useful, and there's also perhaps useful things to learn from them. And so we play this strange symbolic game with the world, like children pretending. That's another way of thinking about it. And we do that to act out and to begin to understand things we don't understand, like how to act. Now for me, the most important question in life is not what the world is made of. And in fact, I would say that's a relatively new preoccupation of humankind. You know, we didn't really formalize, you could say that the ancient Greeks laid the groundwork for the emergence of an empirical science. And then it emerged more formally with Bacon and Descartes and Newton 500-600 years ago, not very long, like a blink of the eye in human terms. Before that, people were engineers, they could build things and so forth, but they didn't know how to, they weren't scientists. They didn't really conceptualize the world as an objective place. We do that automatically because science has seeped so far into our set of presuppositions. That doesn't make us good scientists, by the way, but it does make us believe that the fundamental reality of the world is an objective reality, and I'm not going to dispute that particularly, but leaves one set of questions unanswered, probably by its nature, because it wasn't designed to answer the question, and that question is, how should one conduct oneself in the world? And that's an important thing, since you're alive, and hypothetically you'd rather stay alive, and while you're alive you probably don't want to suffer any more than you have to, and no more stupidly than you have to, and it might also be good if some of the things that you wanted actually happened, and so you're motivated to know how to act, and people are always telling each other how to act. We're sending each other information all the time about how to act. We do that with the expressions on our face, and of course when we talk to people we always look at their face, and that's because their face tells you what they're up to. If they're smiling and paying attention to you, well then you can assume that you're doing something right, and if they're looking annoyed or disgusted, that's a particularly bad one, then you might take a hint from that, especially if 3 or 4 people are doing it at the same time. And so we're reflecting some ideal to one another constantly, and the more attentive you are, the more likely you are to act in accordance with that ideal, and the more likely you are to move towards it. You may not even know what the ideal is in an articulated sense. In fact, you probably don't. You could come up with a good person is nice and friendly and cooperative, and that's all just cliche. But you don't, your conception might be very hollow. It's very likely that it's very hollow, even though you may be able to act in a very sophisticated manner. Alright, so anyways, this is a story. I'd say it's a meta story. It's what would happen if you collected a bunch of stories and then you extracted out a story from them. And it's sort of a story about destiny, and it's couched in a religious language, but that's okay, because most of these distilled stories form the foundation of religious texts, and myths and stories are, as I said, part of the outer perimeter of our society. They have a coherent nature, and they form a foundation, and it's on that foundation that everything that you take for granted rests, even if you don't understand the foundation. So I can give you an example. There's a metaphysical idea that underlies Western civilization, and that metaphysical idea is that the individual has transcendent worth. That's the idea from which the notion of natural rights is derived. And of course our legal system is predicated on the idea that you have certain natural rights. They're enshrined in the Bill of Rights, for example. And in the States, when the Bill of rights was being formulated, when the original legislation that founded the state was being formulated, the formulators said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. What does that mean? They're axioms of faith, right? They're propositions, and there's no proof for them. They're a mode of operation in the world. And so the hypothesis is something like, well, if I treat you like there's something about you that has transcendent value, implicit, intrinsic value, whatever that might be, and there are stories about that and we'll talk about that, and you do the same to me, and then we set up a body of laws that recognizes the sovereignty of the individual, so that the law itself has to act with respect towards every individual, even if that individual has done something reprehensible, which is very weird if you think about it, then our society will work better. And, well, perhaps that's true, but for better or worse, that is what this society is predicated on, and that's a very, 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 very old idea. And it's an idea that people came to with great difficulty, because it was over thousands of years that people learned how to take their little tribal groups, which were always squabbling with one another, right, because they're human beings, they're very violent, and tribal groups are by no means civilized. There's no noble savage like the Europeans thought. If you study tribal groups in the world today, the death rate by violence is unbelievably high. So something unites a tribe within a tribe, it's often kinship, but then tribes come together to form larger civilizations, and they have to determine some sort of meta principle that guides them so that they can cooperate and come together without destroying one another, and they have to extract out a principle by which the society might function, and that has to work. And then as societies get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they have to bring more and more of these diverse traditions together and extract out something from them that has power and functional utility and that allows people to unite. And so this is one of the stories that talks about that. It's a story about individual responsibility and what happens when it's not heeded. So, you know, because we could say, you are a social creature, right to the core, and most of your environment is other people, and those other people want something from you, and you want something from them, so you're going to play games with them. You're either going to be good at it or you're going to be bad at it, but you're going to play games with them. And so the game might have rules, really sophisticated rules, in fact. And you'd expect that, because as your behavior more and more approximates an ideal, assuming such a thing exists, then you're more and more sophisticated, and the nature of the ideal is perhaps more and more complex and difficult to understand. You get a hint of this, though. You can get a hint of this because you will see, if you pay attention to your own soul, your psyche, your unconscious, you'll see that there are people that you admire and that there are people that you have contempt for. And it isn't necessarily that you're 100% accurate in your judgment. You know, it's not such a bad idea to criticize your first impressions, but those states exist, and so there's a reason you admire someone, and there's a reason you have contempt for someone. There may be multiple reasons, and that's a hint to your intrinsic value structure. It's a hint about your intrinsic value structure, right? You wouldn't admire someone unless there was something about them that you valued, and perhaps that you would also like to be able to do, and you wouldn't despise someone or have contempt for them if you didn't feel that something they were doing was wrong, and that it would be wrong if you did it too. And so you're bringing to bear on the situation an implicit morality, and you have to do that because, as I said, you can't act without a morality, because if you're going to act, you're going to try to make things better. Otherwise, why bother? And if you're acting to make things better, then some things have to be better and some things have to be worse, and that's a value structure. So you have one. All right, so Jonah, he gets a call from God, and God tells them that there's a city, Nineveh, that's falling into moral disarray. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a universal story. It's like all cultures are always falling into disarray. It's their nature. Just entropy does that, right? Things change, the world changes, the environment changes, and the culture doesn't keep up very well, and then of course it has corrupt elements, and so it's an eternal story. The individual is always placed in relationship to a culture that's somewhat corrupt. And then the question is, well, what do you do about it? And if the answer is nothing, well then it'll just get more corrupt. And if the answer is be corrupt too, then it will just get more corrupt. So the answer has to be to oppose the corruption, because that's the only way it's going to stop. Now, God threatens to destroy this city because of its corruption, and I don't think you need to presume anything particularly metaphysical about that to understand it. It's very straightforward that the more corrupt a culture is and the less trust is possible between individuals, the less productive the culture is going to be, because why do anything if some corrupt person is just going to come and take it? You know, it might even be that the culture is so corrupt that if you are good for something and you produce resources, you're actually more likely to get killed because you have something of value. So like you're just not going anywhere with that. And why would you work if you didn't have any sense that, you know, you could store up the value of your work for some reasonable time in the future? So if the society is corrupt and there's no trust, it's degenerating. And you know, it might live for a while, but isn't going to last very long, and so that's the idea. Corrupt societies collapse. That leaves open what corruption means. Anyways, Jonah thinks, no, no bloody way. I'm not going to that city. They can go to hell as far as I'm concerned, and that's really what he thinks. And why in the world should I do anything about it anyways? And these are good objections. It's like, why would you do that? And you'll face this, believe me, in your life. You will face this. In fact, you already do, always, constantly, continually, in small ways perhaps, when you're interacting with people who aren't treating you properly. And when you're acting, and those might be your parents, they might be your friends, they might be people at your workplace, they might be professors. They're playing a crooked game, and you don't like it, and you know it's crooked. And so then the question is, well, what should you do about it? Well, if you know it's crooked, it's not so good to play along with it. I mean, we'll say that you know it's crooked by your own standard of values. It degrades you to play along with it. You're going to stand up and oppose it? Well, no, probably not. You're probably going to do what Jonah did, jump on a ship and get the hell out of there. And, you know, that's a logical thing to do, but it doesn't solve the problem. And I think this has something to do with human ethical responsibility, because there are other old stories, and I'll tell you one likely, where the son of the king, the Lion King, the son of the king, he goes off and he's some pathetic adolescent, and then he's shamed by the reappearance of his old girlfriend into turning into something vaguely useful, and he opens his eyes and he goes back and he fights Scar, and you know, it's a scene of hell, right, because there's fire everywhere, and he fights Scar, he finds out Scar killed his father, he casts him into the pit, roughly speaking, and then the rain comes, and then, you know, the movie returns to its beginning, fundamentally. It's paradise, paradise lost, paradise regained. That's the movie. And I mean, that's the story of human beings, you know. You're in a place that's working out pretty well, something happens to knock you off your perch, you're down in the chaos for a good amount of time, and maybe you never get out. But maybe you learn something down there, maybe you strengthen your character, then you pop up to a new place, and maybe it's better. Better aim, better you. Now, I'm not being overly optimistic about this. I know perfectly well that people encounter impediments during their life that they find almost impossible to recover from, but it's the best shot you have. So anyways, Jonah runs away, but God isn't very happy about that because it's actually Jonah's destiny. It's necessary for Jonah to repair the city. So God sends a storm, and you know, the waves are high, and I think what that means is because the water is often a symbol for the unconscious, and that's because things lurk down there in the water and that you can pull up that are useful. Monstrous things that you can pull up that are useful. You can fish for them. You can go fishing in your own being for answers, which is what you do when you try to think, right? You ask yourself a question and you wait, and maybe an answer appears. It's like, where did that come from? You didn't know what the answer was before it appeared. Would it just pop into being out of nowhere? Who knows? So you fish. So anyways, the waves come and the boat's going to be knocked over, and that's what happens, I think, when you know you should do something. I mean, everyone has this experience, I believe. Perhaps you would be willing to put up your hands if this experience is foreign to you. Okay? There's part of you telling you you should do something, and it's hard to do it, effortful, and maybe you're afraid of it, and so you don't do it. You just procrastinate, right? And so how do you feel about that? Good? I mean, so what, you feel that you're betraying yourself. Your anxiety actually gets worse, not better, even though you can put it off moment to moment, but that doesn't help because every time you put it off, the anxiety just grows a little bit. You're not proud of yourself. You have a sense that you're making things more chaotic than they should be. And if you do that long enough, and I'm sure many of you have had that experience, if you do that long enough, if that becomes habitual, things will get so stormy around you that you'll fall right into the chaos, into the watery chaos, and maybe you'll drown. So it's not a very good idea to run from your destiny, let's say. Whatever that might be. And you need a destiny, you need a place to aim at because that's what gives your life meaning. And you need meaning in your life because life is hard. So, you need something to buttress yourself against that. So anyways, they wake Jonah up and Jonah says, it's probably my fault because I'm running away from something I'm supposed to do, and God isn't very happy about that, so why don't you just throw me overboard? And the crew isn't very happy about that, but the waves are really starting to come up and Jonah's pretty insistent that he's the cause of the problem, and so they draw lots, and Jonah is chosen, and so they decide to toss him into the ocean, and immediately everything's calm. So he's a center of chaos because he's not doing what he's supposed to do. Fine. Well, then a whale comes up and swallows him, and then he's in the whale for 3 days. Now, that's a weird thing. The whale, that's the whale that Geppetto's in. That's a dragon. It's that thing that you have to go out there and conquer to get something of value. Now, when you've made an error, when you've fallen off the pathway, when you've deviated from what you know you should do, it produces a state of internal chaos and worry and concern. You're thrust into the unknown. You're thrust into unknown territory and chaos. You don't know what to do. And that's often symbolized by the encounter with a monster, like a dragon, or something that lives under the water. And I think the reason for that is, as far as I've been able to tell, is that human beings, because we've been prey animals for forever, in our battle with carnivorous lizards, for example, and alligators, and even dinosaurs, because there were dinosaurs around at the time of our most distant ancestors. And there was even a cat at one point that was adapted with teeth to pierce human skulls. So it had a head that was exactly shaped to grab you here and put a tooth through the back of your skull. So we've come through some rough times, man. And we have a system in our mind that's a threat predator detection system. That's the thing that makes little kids think about monsters in the dark, right? Because, well, there is monsters in the dark. Parents always say, well, there's no monsters in the dark. It's like, that's not true. The dark is full of monsters. There might not be any in your room right at that moment, but that doesn't mean there aren't monsters in the dark. And crimes take place, criminals don't get up at 6 in the morning and you know, have breakfast and go rob a bank. They do that sort of thing at night. People do the things that are fit for the night in the night. And lots of predators are nocturnal. And you can't see very well in the dark. And kids aren't stupid, you know. They've evolved to stay pretty damn close to the fire. Because the kids that wandered away from the fire got picked off by hyenas and lions and, you know, crocodiles and whatever else the hell was out there to eat the unwary. So, the circuit that we use to defend ourselves against predators, as we've evolved cortically, that circuit has come to represent what we don't know in general. Because the predators, of course, inhabit where we don't know. And so, evolution is a conservative force, and we use the circuits that we've evolved to represent new things. And so, the unknown, the chaos, is often represented by a monster that swallows you up and pulls you down. And you know, when you're feeling terrible, you don't say, well, I'm feeling up. You say, I'm feeling down. Well, why is that? Well, down is worse. I guess you're flat on the ground when you're down, or you're in a hole or something like that. You're hiding in a hole. You know, it's down. And you're threatened by something. You know, maybe you're threatened by your own inadequacy. That might be part of it. Maybe that's partly what you imagine as a monstrous force, because, you know, your proclivity towards procrastination and your weakness of character is part and parcel of why you happen to be in the underworld. And that's the underworld, the mythological underworld. That's where you go when things fall apart. And if you understand that, if you know that that's what that means, then you have one of the keys that opens up ancient stories to you, and you understand things. Your life can be organized and going very well, and then something comes up, and poof, everything changes. Some axiom that you were living by, and it might be the existence of a partner, it might be a job, it might be your health, any of those things, gone. And you go somewhere when that happens. You go somewhere. It's a state of being. You're still in the same world, but it's not the same at all anymore. Everything about it is different. It's all negative and dark, and you don't know what to do. You're confused. And so, what do you do down there in the underworld when things have fallen apart, especially if it's the worst possible case scenario and you realize that you actually had something to do with your demise? That's really annoying, you know, when something bad happens to you, and then, you know, you grind yourself into bits trying to figure out what the hell happened, and then you realize that, well, you were playing a causal role. Now, sometimes you're so depressed you assume you're playing a causal role, and you weren't. It's not easy to figure out by any stretch of the imagination. And it isn't that everyone who does something terrible is at fault for it, but sometimes you find that you were off the path somehow, and maybe even that you knew it and that you didn't attend to it, and that's why all of this hit the fan. And so then down there in that chaos, you decide that you're going to do what you're supposed to do instead. And then maybe you get to rise up again, renewed, if you're lucky, and then you can go fix the city. And that's what this story's about. And that's why I picked the image to represent the course, because really what happens, you see, with the psychoanalysts, the road to health, if you're not doing well, which means that as you act in the world you're not getting what you want, there's something wrong with the match between your presuppositions and your actions, habitual, and the way the world is responding to you. And so it's not turning out for you. And the question is, well, what can you do about that? And one answer might be to examine yourself for presuppositions and action patterns that are not serving you well, and to find out what they are and what to do about them. And maybe some of that is, maybe you're not moving forward because of fear, and maybe that fear is grounded in terrible experiences that you had in the past that you've never been able to understand. And maybe one of the ways of gluing yourself back together and expanding your personality so that you could in fact live properly in the world is to go back to those terrible events and untie them and straighten them out and understand them and drop them. And that's what psychotherapy is about, in large part. Psychoanalytic, behavioral, doesn't matter. What are you afraid of? What are you avoiding? What are you failing to develop? Maybe from fear, maybe from avoidance, God only knows, maybe from disgust. How can you get over it? How can you reclaim those parts of yourself? I said in the first lecture that I was going to try to provide you with a schema into which you could place the theorists that we're going to discuss. And it requires going down deep to do that. And there are presuppositions. My presupposition, and this is a psychoanalytic presupposition, it's predicated on a poetic tradition, I would say, on an ancient tradition. I learned most of it from reading Jung. It was Carl Jung that helped me understand that we're nested inside a dream, that we have to be, because we don't know everything. We have to take things as givens, and the things that we take as givens are nested inside stories, and we accept the stories as valid, and then outside the stories is the absolute unknown. You know, and that's partly, the stories are tricky, you know. One of the classic stories, it's a variant of the Jonah story, I would say, is St. George and the Dragon. And that story was represented during the Renaissance and during medieval times thousands and thousands of ways. It's like the story of St. Patrick who chased the snakes out of Ireland. Same idea. And the typical St. George story is The Hobbit or Harry Potter. So in the second volume of Harry Potter, correct me if I have any of these details wrong, you remember there's that snake, the basilisk. So there's this magic castle, right? You guys have no problem with that. Magic castle, no problem. There's an orphan, he's an orphan, he goes to the magic castle to learn how to be more than normal, right? The Muggles, he has a Muggle family. We're not too happy with the Muggle family. Like, as representatives of normal people, they have some lacks. Now, of course, the reason for that is that, well, that's what teenagers often feel about their parents, right? They feel, Jesus, these couldn't really be my parents. I must have some other parents who are like together. And those are like magical parents, right? Parents that live in the sky. And of course, Harry Potter has earthly parents. That's the Muggles. And Dursley, I think, is the kid. He's a wonderful piece of work. And you know, ill-formed, eh? Spoiled, ill-formed, selfish, very far from the ideal. He's a foil for Harry. And of course he's appreciated and doted on, and Harry is actually punished for his virtues. Well, that's a classic story, right? To be punished for your virtues. I mean, if you look at the story, the central story in Christianity, the central story in Christianity is about someone who is precisely punished in the worst possible way for the highest possible virtues. And that's what it makes it an archetypal story, because there isn't anything more unfair than that. And so it's a limit, in a sense. It can't be worse than that. Being punished for being, you know, unworthy, it's like, yeah, well, at least makes sense. But to be punished because you have your act together and you're a good person, that's real punishment. And that's what happens to Harry. So luckily he finds out that he's magical, which is quite convenient, and off he goes to wizarding school. And you know, that's actually like going and studying the humanities. I mean, it was when they still were, you know, because it's through the humanities that you make contact with the magic of your culture, and that makes you more than merely the child of your parents, because you are more than merely the child of your parents. You're the child of nature, and you're the child of culture. And until you understand what that means, understand that you have two sets of parents, like the divine hero always has two sets of parents, you can't construe yourself properly as an individual. You're not situated properly in the world. You don't know what your responsibilities are. You can't orient your values properly, and you will suffer for that. Because, as far as I can tell, because life is so difficult, you have to do something that's truly worthwhile in order to justify it. And so, well, and that's what all these stories tell you. That's what the story of Jonah is telling you. It's like you have an ethical duty to straighten things up, and if you don't do it, you're going to be sorry. And that story is echoed everywhere. Well, now St. George, well, let's go to Harry Potter. That's what we were talking about. So he goes off to the magic castle, and he's learning to be a wizard. And he's kind of an interesting character, because he's not really good. And we find out, I think that's because, doesn't he have a piece of Voldemort in him? Isn't that what happens? Yeah. And that's what that means, is that to be good, truly good, you can't just follow rules. That's very clear in the Harry Potter story. And you also have to be able to understand malevolence. And in order to understand malevolence so that you can withstand it, you have to understand that part of you that's malevolent. Because if you don't, you're naive. And if you're naive, you're easy pickings. And so that's a Jungian idea too. And the Jungian idea is that part of personality development is to understand your shadow. And the shadow is those things about you that you do not want to admit to. And you can learn about your shadow by reading history. You know, you can read about Auschwitz. You can read about the concentration camps in Russia. And you can imagine yourself as a guard instead of as a heroic rescuer of unfortunate victims, which would be very, very unlikely. And once you can imagine yourself as a guard, which is a terrifying thing to do, then you understand something about yourself. And I actually think, and I think this is also from studying Jung, that you cannot have proper respect for yourself until you know that you're a monster, because you won't act carefully enough. You know, if you think, well, I'm a nice person, I'd never do anyone any harm, it's like, you're no saint. You can be sure of that. And the harm that you do people can come in many, many ways. And so, if you regard yourself as harmless, inoffensive, nice, well, why do you have any reason to be careful? You're like a teddy bear sitting on a shelf. Even if you throw it at someone, no one's going to get hurt. But that isn't what you're like, because you're a human being, and human beings are some vicious creatures. And there's utility in knowing that, because it's also the case, you know, in the Harry Potter series, Harry could stand up against Voldemort and understand him and speak his language because he was infected by him to some degree. A very, very interesting idea. Anyways, in the second, and the reason I'm telling you this, and this is worth thinking about, it's like, how long were each of those books? Like 500 pages? They're long, eh? And there was, how many of them? 7? And how many of them were sold? I mean, how many of you read every Harry Potter book? Right? How many of you read at least one? Okay, how many of you saw the movies? It's like, you're all in a cult. You are, I'm telling you, really, that's the truth. It's really the truth. So, in the second volume, there's this snake that's zipping around there, the basilisk, right? And it lives in the underground. That's chaos. That's chaos. And that's because wherever you are, you're on thin ice, and underneath your thin ice is chaos. And here we are in this unbelievably civilized environment, and everyone's getting along so perfectly. But you know, we've got lights, we've got electricity, the sewage system is working, no one's hungry. It's like, we can be peaceful. But if any of that fell apart, and it could easily fall apart because it's a bloody miracle it ever works at all, then the chaos that's just underneath the surface is going to come up right now. And it's useful to know that, because it makes you properly grateful. If you really understand it, it makes you properly grateful for the bloody miracle that it is that you can be here in peace. So anyways, there's this snake that's underneath the surface, and it's, you know, no joke, that thing. It's big, and it's ancient. It's always been there. And what happens if you look at it? It turns you to stone, right? It paralyzes you. Well, that's the Gorgon, that's Medusa. the woman with the head of snakes, and if you look at her, it paralyzes you. Well, what does that mean? Well, you're walking through the jungle and a big snake appears. What do? You freeze, and no bloody wonder, because you're a prey animal, and that's what they do when they see things that are going to eat them. And so the snake, well, lots of people still die from snake bite. And our ancestors were, and I mean our ancestors like, tens of millions of years ago, when they were living in trees and weren't very big, they made a nice snack for a snake. And there's a woman named Lynn Isbell, who's an anthropologist at UCLA, who's correlated the presence of carnivorous snakes with the acuity of primate vision. And what she found was that the more snakes around, the better the primates could see. So, and we're particularly good at picking up patterns like snake camouflage in the lower half of our visual quadrant. And people generally don't like snakes. You can learn to handle them, but no, snake fear appears to be innate. It's innate in chimpanzees, and it tends to increase as you age rather than decreasing. You can overcome it, but, well, my daughter had snakes, and one day her snake bit her. It was a fairly big snake, and she hadn't paid attention to it for a while, so it nailed her. And from then on, she had very difficult time grabbing the snake. It was like bitten once, shy permanently. She also told me years later, she had nightmares about snakes all the time when she had a snake in her room. It's like, and I think it was probably the smell. So, anyways. So, Harry Potter decides he's going to go after the basilisk, right? He's going to go out there and face the thing that he's most afraid of. So he does that. Way down in the depths. So it's like Jonah going down into the depths. And he faces the basilisk, and it bites him. And that's right, because if you go down into the depths, you can get bitten. Like, it's no joke. And this is a hero story, but the thing about the hero story is it's actually real. The thing that you're facing is actually dangerous. And even though facing it voluntarily might be your best bet, and is likely your best bet, because that's the central story of humanity, that doesn't mean you're going to succeed. It's the real thing. So anyways, he gets bitten, right? And he's going to die. Now, he's rescuing Ginny. So that's the St. George story. If you go after, like, dragons like to capture virgins. God only knows why. I think it's because one of the things that male humans have done from the beginning of time is chase the damn predators away. And I suspect that the males from God only knows how long ago, who were particularly good at that, were rewarded with female attention, and why the hell not? So it's deeply rooted inside of us, that idea of facing the unknown and freeing the woman. So the idea there is that it's a male idea in large part. I can talk about the central female myth, and I will as we proceed. The idea is that if you're the sort of person who can stand up against the unknown and the frightening, then you're also likely, if you develop into that sort of person, then you're also likely to develop into the sort of person that other people will find attractive. So, and that's why Jung believed that inside the shadow was the anima, which is like a female figure. And so his idea was something like, if you watch movies, there's always this beta male guy, if they're romantic movies, and he's a nice guy, and he's the friend, and the woman tells him everything, but she doesn't like him a bit. She likes the guy who's like got an edge, and who's capable of, I would say, mayhem, but at least of aggression. Now, that doesn't mean she wants him to be aggressive, but what it does mean is that she wants him to be able to be aggressive. That would be good. And so he's the romantic target, and so he's the person that's incorporated the shadow, and he's someone that is respectable and perhaps useful. And so, well, that's a very old story. So let's think about this for a minute. I've already offered you a proposition, and I think it's an important proposition, and I'm offering you this proposition so that you can make sense of art and literature and mythology and religion and dance and all those strange ritualistic things that human beings do, which seem central to us, including, not least, the ineradicable tendency of us to seek out stories of heroes. I should finish the Harry Potter story. So Harry Potter goes down there to rescue Virginia. No, that's not her name. What is it? Ginny, yeah. But there's a formal name for that. It's a variant of Virginia anyways, which is a variant of virgin. So, and he gets bitten. Yes, Ginevra, that's it. He gets bitten, and the bite is poison. And so there he is, dying, which doesn't seem to be so good. And then what happens? And again, you guys swallow this, it's no problem. So, what's his name, the Dumbledore character? He's got a bird, right? So he's the wise old man. He's the ruler of the castle. He's the ruler of the magic castle. He's the magic king. You know, he's like God the Father as far as Harry Potter is concerned. And he has a bird. What kind of bird is it? It's a phoenix, right? And one of the things that's very strange about a phoenix is that, well, it's immortal, but in a strange way, you know, it lives and lives, I think, 100 years, and it gets older and older, and then one day, poof, it bursts into flames and turns into an egg, and then you get a new phoenix. So that's a symbol of transformation. It's a symbol of transformation. The bird is a spirit or psyche. And so here's what it means, in part. You know how when you learn a lesson in your life that's not very pleasant? Right? It's not like when you learn something important, it's the best day of your life. It's often, the importance of what you learn is often proportionate to just how wretched it is to learn it. You know, you learn things the hard way. You learn things by getting hit, because obviously, if what you're doing is working, you get what you want. There's no learning in that, and that's happy. It's when you're doing something and you hit an obstacle, and maybe you bloody well hit it hard, and then, you know, you recoil, and then you down into the depths you go, and you have to sort yourself out, and you realize that you're, you know, this particular kind of idiot, and that you should probably fix that, and that's really annoying and difficult, and, you know, and maybe you're down in the dumps and anxious for quite a while, and then you get it repaired more or less, and, you know, you put yourself back together. That's the phoenix. Poof, into flames, bang, egg, new you. And so, you know, that's the ability to learn. Now, human beings are very strange creatures, right? Because we're very malleable compared to most animals, you know, like grizzly bears now and grizzly bears 1,000 years ago. It's like, whatever. They're the same thing. They do the same thing. There's no transformation. But human beings, we have this massive brain. And, you know, it's a pain because it means you have to take care of human children until they're 40. And that's a big burden. And so, you know, we pay a big price for it. It also makes childbirth very difficult. And it's costly. You have to eat a lot because you have a big brain, because it uses up a lot of energy. And so, you know, you pay a price for it. But the advantage is you're plastic. You can learn. Now, learning is a strange thing, because you can think of it as just acquiring more information. But you could also think of it, and this is more accurate, as finding out something that you're doing wrong, so that's sort of built into you, like a character element of your character, a presumption of your perception, or a deep habit. It's really built into you. It's a neural structure, right? It's alive. And you have to kill it because it isn't working properly. And the pain that you go through, in part, when you're suffering because you did something stupid, is it's something like the neurology. I can never get this quite right. It's the pain of the death of that structure. And that can be a huge chunk of you, you know, if you really have to go through a massive revision. It's like the person that comes out the other end might hardly be the same at all. You know, that happens, for example, if you're trying to combat alcoholism, which is just, you know, a wretched thing to do because, well, all your friends are alcoholic. all your family drinks too much. The only thing you know how to do when you're socializing is to go to the bar and drink too much. You know, and you spend like 20 hours a week on it. It's like, it's not just that you're addicted to the substance, it's like that's how you live. And so if you want to stop being an alcoholic, not only do you have to stop drinking alcohol, but you have to stop seeing all your drunk friends, and maybe you've had them for your whole life, and you have to have continual battles with your drunk family, and then you have to figure out something to do with that 20 hours that's now like hanging around your neck like an albatross. And so you have to let that whole part of your personality die, and a new part has to spring forth. And that's what the phoenix is. And the phoenix is the capacity of the person to transform. And so when Harry gets bit by the snake that freezes him, he gets seriously injured. The phoenix comes in, cries some tears in his wound. It repairs him. Bang! He's back to life. And the strange thing is that that's okay with all of the viewers. Now, why would that be? There's nothing about it that's rational. Nothing. Right? Magic castle? That's not rational. Giant snake underneath it? That's a little more rational. Turning you to stone, going down there to face it, being rejuvenated by a phoenix? It's like, yeah, that's okay. We'll watch that. We'll swallow it. We'll be completely engaged in it. And the reason for that is because it's a myth. It's about how people, it's a meta story about how to act, about how to conduct yourself in the world, to face the things that you're afraid of that would otherwise paralyze you, to let the death of what is insufficient about you occur, and then to wait for the rebirth. Okay, so science is about what the world is, and myth and drama and dream and the unconscious, all of that. Let's say the aesthetic and artistic and fantastic side of humanity. That's more about how things should be. It's more about how to act. They're lessons in how to act. And they're abstract lessons. People are capable of abstraction, right? So you say, well, there's something good about you, and there's something good about you, and there's something good about you, and there's something bad about you, and you, and you. And so we'll take all the good things and make one good thing out of that. We'll take all the bad things and make one bad thing out of that. And then we sort of understand the difference between good and bad. And we get better and better and better and better at that over the centuries as we distill that, and then we have a figure of ultimate good and a figure of ultimate evil. And that helps us understand what those two things are. Those are the hostile brothers. That's a very common mythological motif. And you could say, well, they're at war inside you. And I think that that's a universal truth. It's an existential truth. The domain of ethics and morality is how are we in the world, and how should we be? What's the good? And the reason I'm telling you all this, apart from the fact that you should know it, because this is what you should know if you go through university, is that it bears directly on issues of health. You're trying to accomplish something, say if you go see a psychotherapist, you could say, well, I'm trying to get healthy. But that's not really right. What you're trying to do when you go see a therapist is get your life together. And that's not the same thing, like mostly when I'm acting as a therapist, it's not like I'm directly treating mental disorder. Like mental disorders they're just not neat little boxes. It's not like someone has a fully functioning life, but they have an anxiety disorder. And then you bring them and you treat the anxiety disorder and they go back to their fully functioning life. It's not like that at all. The disorder is tangled out into their life. If you're depressed, well, usually your workplace isn't going very well, and your relationships with the people around you are damaged, and you're connected in the actual world with all of these things. And so when you come to see a therapist, you have to work on putting your life together in a sustainable manner, and that's certainly not just removing the mental illness. It's very rare. Now and then you see someone who's depressed, whose life is together, and they're just depressed. Something's gone wrong, probably biochemically. And so with someone like that, you can often give them SSRIs. I can't give them to them, but I can recommend them. Recommend they go see a doctor anyways. And that sometimes just does the trick, because their life is actually pretty good, they just can't see it. But that's bloody rare, man. It's usually the case that someone comes and sees you and things are in a serious state of chaos, and all of that has to be addressed, and some of it's psychological and a lot of it's just practical. It's embedded out there in the world. That's what the behavioral psychologists are particularly concerned about. So anyways, psychology, especially the clinical end, is predicated on, necessarily predicated on the question, how is it that we obtain the good? How do we aim at the good? And what would that be? When my clients first come to see me, one of the things I often ask them is, okay, well, let's say you look a year ahead. What do you want? What are we aiming at? Your life isn't the way you want it to be. How would it look if it was the way you wanted it to be? Or at least partly that way. Then we aim at that, right? And we look for impediments, psychological impediments, fears, avoidance strategies, that sort of thing. And we develop strategies. And we try to move towards that, I would say, ideal. All right, to understand the categories of myth, we'll say, we have to understand something about the nature of categorization. Now, categorization is a tricky thing, and we're going to run through some complicated ideas relatively quickly. You think you put things in the same category because they're similar, but the problem is that, first of all, that's not an answer. It's just a restatement of the initial proposition. And second of all, you can put things in the same category that are by no means identical, and you often do that. And third, things that are similar are often also importantly different. And so picking which element of similarity, like let's say you have a group of books. Well, are they the same? Well, obviously no, because unless they're all the same book. But the category of books is a pretty strange category because the content of the books differs completely. Well, you could still make a group of books and you pick some arbitrary element that unites them and consider that grounds to make a category. There's other categories, more scientific categories, and scientific categories tend to actually contain things that are very, very similar across multiple dimensions. Like protons are like that. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that distinguishes one proton from another, and the same with electrons. And the set of triangles is like that because you can define it precisely. But most of the categories that human beings use aren't so neat, and the problem with that is that unless the categories are neat, like scientific categories, it's very difficult to investigate them scientifically. So for example, you might do research on a group of people with anxiety disorders, but the problem with that is that the anxiety disorder category is so heterogeneous that it's almost impossible to identify the commonalities across all the people who are in that category, and that's partly because the category isn't actually a scientific category. It's a hybrid category. It's a practical category. I can give you an example of that. No, I can't because I must not have saved it. Anyways, many of the DSM categories, so these are categories for psychopathology, require, if you're part of that category, imagine there's 7 symptoms that you could have or 8 symptoms that you could have that would put you in that category, like antisocial personality. 8 symptoms: you steal, you kick, you hit, you bite, you're abusive. I don't remember the categories precisely, but you can be in the category if you have symptoms 2 through 5, and you can be in the category if you have symptoms 6 through 8. They aren't the same symptoms, but you're in the same category. And you think, well, how the hell can that be? Well, that's a family resemblance category, roughly speaking, and lots of the things that we use are family resemblance categories. There's a prototype, and then if you have enough of the features of that prototype, imagine the prototype has 10 features, and if you have 6 of those features, you get to be in that category. But it means that the category is actually quite diverse, and that's one of the problems that plagues psychiatry as a science and clinical psychology as a science. It's a really big problem, because if the categories aren't homogeneous, then it's very difficult to draw conclusions about the members of the category. And the psychologists and the psychiatrists claim that those are scientific categories, but they're not, and they can't be, partly because they're aimed at the classification of health or ideal versus non-health or non-ideal, and partly because they play multiple roles, eh? I mean, the category isn't there just to provide neat demarcations for scientific study. The category is there to give people a language to talk about certain sets of symptoms, to diagnose, because, you know, when you come in and you have a set of symptoms, you might want to know what they are, so that you also know what they aren't. It's really a relief often to find a diagnosis. And then of course the diagnosis has certain implications for treatment and for billing and for all of that, so the category has to play all of those roles. So there's multiple types of category, and the categories that we're talking about in relationship to mythology aren't scientific categories. They're categories about the world construed as a place to act. So here's a way to think about it. You're always looking at the world through a framework of reference, and you have to do that because there isn't very much of you. You can't see the whole world at once, and in fact the amount of the world you actually see is so small you can't believe it. The central part of your vision is zipping around, producing a pretty high resolution representation of exactly what you're looking at, but outside of that center, like if I look at you, I can't see her eyes. I can see her glasses, but barely. I can't even tell whether you're male or female. The person past that, I can't see at all. Now you don't notice that, you know. You don't notice that you're that blind because your central vision is always popping around, illuminating that tiny space. But you're so damn blind, it's just mind-boggling. And I'm sure some of you have seen the Invisible Gorilla video, you know, where a gorilla comes into the video and you don't notice, which is somewhat shocking because you would think that you would notice a gorilla. But what happens is that you actually don't notice something unless it interferes with what you're doing. And because what are you going to do? Notice everything? You can't do that. You can hardly notice anything. So what you do is you pick something to focus on. It's usually something that you value, because why else would you focus on it? So that means that your value system determines the direction of your perception.